Samuel's hands trembled as he carried his supplies toward the barn. Every step seemed to echo loudly in the still night air, and he was certain that the sisters would wake up and discover him at any moment. But from inside the barn came only the soft sounds of peaceful sleep. Working as quietly as possible, Samuel positioned wooden boards across the barn door and began nailing them in place. The sound of the hammer seemed impossibly loud to him, and he paused after each nail to listen for any sign that the sisters had awakened. But they must have been exhausted from their preparations, because they continued sleeping even as Samuel sealed them inside. When the door was securely barricaded, Samuel used rope to tie the boards even more firmly in place. The barn had only one other exit, a small window near the back, and Samuel quickly nailed boards across that as well. By the time he was finished, Ayanna and Helona were completely trapped inside. Just as Samuel was putting away his tools, he heard movement from within the barn. Then came Ayanna's voice, no longer speaking in broken English but in the clear, educated tone he had overheard earlier. "What's happening out there?" she called. "Samuel, why can't we open the door?" Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he ran to his corral and quickly saddled his fastest horse. Behind him, he could hear both sisters shouting now, their voices filled with growing panic and anger. "Samuel," Helona screamed. "Let us out." "What are you doing?" "We know you can hear us," Ayanna added, her voice now cold with fury. "This is a mistake you'll regret." The threats confirmed everything Samuel had suspected about their true nature. He mounted his horse and spurred it toward the Johnson Ranch, the closest of his neighbors' homes. Behind him, the sisters continued shouting, but their voices quickly faded as he rode hard across the desert. The Johnson Ranch was 5 miles away across rough terrain, but Samuel's horse was strong and sure-footed. As he rode, Samuel tried to figure out how he would explain the situation. The truth sounded so incredible that he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. 2 friendly Apache women were actually enemy scouts preparing for a coordinated attack at dawn. It sounded like the ravings of a paranoid mind, but he had to try. Billy Johnson's life depended on it, along with the lives of his parents and everyone else in the territory. Samuel reached the Johnson Ranch just as the first pale light of dawn was beginning to show on the eastern horizon. He pounded on the door until Tom Johnson appeared, rifle in hand and looking ready for trouble. "Samuel, what in blazes are you doing here at this hour?" "Tom, you have to listen to me," Samuel said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "There's going to be an attack. Apache warriors, maybe 40 or more. They're planning to hit your ranch and mine and all the others at sunrise." Tom Johnson stared at him with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Attack? Samuel, are you feeling all right? How could you possibly know about something like that?" Samuel quickly explained about the sisters, about overhearing their conversation, about the hidden cave full of weapons and maps. As he talked, he could see doubt and confusion in Tom's eyes. The story did sound crazy, even to Samuel himself. "Those pottery women?" Tom asked. "Samuel, they've been trading here too. Mary bought several pieces from them just last week. They seemed perfectly harmless." "That's what they wanted us to think," Samuel said desperately. "Tom, I know how this sounds, but you have to believe me. Get Mary and Billy somewhere safe, get your rifle, and be ready." Tom Johnson was quiet for a long moment, studying Samuel's face in the dim pre-dawn light. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You look scared enough to convince me, and you're not the type to make up stories. Mary, get Billy and get in the root cellar. Now!" While the Johnson family prepared their defenses, Samuel rode hard toward the Henderson Ranch. The sun was rising quickly now, and he could see smoke from a signal fire beginning to rise from Eagle Peak in the distance. The attack was beginning, whether he was ready or not. At the Henderson Ranch, the conversation was even more difficult. The 2 elderly brothers were skeptical of Samuel's warning and slow to react. Precious minutes were wasted while Samuel tried to convince them that danger was real and immediate. "Apache attack?" Old Pete Henderson asked, scratching his white beard. "We ain't had Indian trouble in these parts for years. Please," Samuel begged. "Just get your rifles and watch the approaches to your ranch. If I'm wrong, you can laugh at me later, but if I'm right..." Finally, the Henderson brothers agreed to take precautions. Samuel left them loading their weapons and rode toward the Murphy Ranch, his horse beginning to tire from the hard riding. Behind him, he could see dust clouds in the distance that might be the approaching war party. The Murphy Ranch was the farthest away, and Samuel wasn't sure his horse could make it there before the attack began. But he had to try. Patrick Murphy and his 3 sons were good fighters, but they needed to know what was coming. As Samuel rode, he heard the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley behind him. The attack had begun. Whether at his ranch or one of the others, Apache warriors were now engaged in battle with surprised settlers. Samuel could only hope that his warnings had been enough to give the families a fighting chance. The Murphy ranch appeared ahead of him, just as Samuel's horse began to stumble with exhaustion. He could see the Murphy men working around their barn, completely unaware of the danger approaching. In the distance, Samuel spotted moving figures that could only be Apache warriors closing in on the ranch. "Patrick!" Samuel shouted as loud as he could. "Indians! Take cover!" The Murphy men looked up in confusion, then saw Samuel riding toward them at full gallop. Behind Samuel, they could now see the approaching warriors as well. Without hesitation, all 4 men grabbed their rifles and took defensive positions. The battle for the Murphy ranch began just as Samuel reached the main house. Bullets whistled through the air around him as he dove for cover behind a water trough. The Apache attack was fierce and well coordinated, but the Murphy family was ready for them. As Samuel caught his breath and checked his rifle, he realized that his desperate gambit had worked, at least partially. The families had been warned, and they were fighting back instead of being slaughtered in their sleep. The coordinated surprise attack that Ayana and Helona had planned was now a series of individual battles, with the settlers having at least some chance to defend themselves. But the morning was far from over, and Samuel could hear gunfire from multiple directions. The Apache warriors were still out there, still dangerous and still determined to complete their mission. Samuel Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he hammered another nail into the fence post. The Arizona sun was already blazing hot, even though it was barely past sunrise. He had been working his ranch for 15 long years now, and every day brought its own set of challenges. The land was harsh, but it was his land, and he had learned to love its wild beauty. As he reached for another board, something caught his eye in the distance. 2 figures were walking toward his homestead, moving slowly across the desert landscape. Samuel squinted against the bright morning light, trying to make out who they might be. Visitors were rare out here, and unexpected ones even rarer. As the figures came closer, Samuel could see they were 2 young women. Their dark hair was braided long down their backs, and they wore simple dresses that looked handmade. They were Apache, he realized, and they were carrying bundles in their arms. Samuel's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle leaning against the fence post, but something about their calm, peaceful approach made him pause. The women stopped about 20 feet away from him. The older one, who looked to be in her early 20s, raised her hand in a gesture of peace. "Good morning," she said in careful, broken English. "We come to trade." Samuel studied them carefully. In all his years on the frontier, he had heard countless stories about Apache raids and attacks. But these 2 didn't look threatening. They looked tired, actually, as if they had been walking for a long time. The younger one, who couldn't have been more than 18, kept her eyes downcast but glanced up at him occasionally with curious dark eyes. "Trade?" Samuel asked, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. "What kind of trade?" The older woman gestured to her bundle. "We make pottery. Beautiful work. We trade for supplies. Food, maybe some cloth." She unwrapped her bundle carefully, revealing several pieces of pottery. Even from where he stood, Samuel could see that the work was exceptional. The pots were decorated with intricate patterns in rich earth tones, and the craftsmanship was better than anything he had seen in the nearby town. "I am Ayana," the older woman said, pointing to herself. Then she gestured to her companion. "This is my sister, Helona." Samuel found himself relaxing slightly. There was something genuine about their manner, something that didn't match the fearsome stories he had heard. "I'm Samuel," he said, stepping forward but keeping a respectful distance. Over the next hour, Samuel examined their pottery while the sisters waited patiently. The work truly was beautiful, and he found himself thinking that these pieces would be perfect for his small kitchen. He hadn't had anything pretty in his house since his wife had passed away 3 years ago. "How much?" he asked, pointing to a medium-sized pot decorated with what looked like birds in flight. Ayana smiled, and for the first time, Helona looked up and smiled too. "You have coffee, sugar, maybe some flour?" Samuel nodded. These were simple requests, and he had plenty of supplies. The trade seemed more than fair. As he went to gather the items they wanted, He noticed how the sisters looked around his property. They weren't being obvious about it, but their eyes took in everything. The layout of his buildings, the corral where he kept his horses, even the path that led to the main road. When he returned with their requested supplies, Samuel noticed something else. While Ayanna had been speaking to him in broken English, he could have sworn he heard the sisters talking to each other in much clearer English when they thought he wasn't listening. But when he tried to focus on their conversation, they seemed to switch back to Apache. "You live here alone?" Ayanna asked as they completed their trade. "Yes," Samuel replied, then wondered why he had volunteered that information so readily. The sisters exchanged a quick glance that Samuel almost missed. "It must be lonely," Helona said softly. Her English was even more broken than her sister's, but there was something in her tone that made Samuel think she understood more than she was letting on. As the sisters prepared to leave, Ayanna turned back to Samuel. "We come again? You like our pottery?" "Yes," Samuel found himself saying. "You're welcome to come back any time." After they left, walking back across the desert in the direction they had come from, Samuel stood in his doorway holding the beautiful pot he had just purchased. Something about the whole encounter had left him feeling unsettled, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. That evening, as he ate his simple dinner, Samuel found himself thinking about the two sisters. There had been something about the way they looked at his property, something about the quick glances they exchanged, that didn't quite sit right with him. But then again, maybe he was just being paranoid. Living alone on the frontier for so many years had a way of making a man suspicious of everything. As he prepared for bed, Samuel looked out his window toward the mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there, Ayanna and Helona were probably settling down for the night too. He wondered where they lived, how far they had traveled to reach his ranch, and why they had chosen his place to visit. The pot sat on his kitchen table, beautiful and mysterious, just like the sisters who had made it. Samuel had no way of knowing that this simple trade would be the beginning of something much more complicated and dangerous than he could ever imagine. All he knew was that he was looking forward to their next visit, despite the strange feeling in his gut that told him something wasn't quite right about these unexpected visitors. 3 weeks passed before Samuel saw the sisters again. He had almost convinced himself that their first visit had been a one-time thing, but then he spotted them walking across the desert toward his ranch on a Tuesday morning. This time they carried even larger bundles, and Samuel found himself genuinely excited to see what new pottery they had brought. "Hello, Samuel," Ayanna called out as they approached. Her English seemed noticeably better than it had been during their first meeting. "Good morning, ladies," Samuel replied, setting down his tools and walking over to meet them. The pottery they showed him this time was even more impressive than before. There were bowls decorated with geometric patterns, water jugs with smooth, elegant curves, and small decorative pieces that would look perfect on a shelf. Samuel ended up trading for several items, giving them supplies that would last them for weeks. As they conducted their business, Samuel noticed that Helona's English had improved dramatically as well. She spoke more freely now, asking questions about his cattle and his daily routine. At first, Samuel was pleased by her increased comfort around him, but something about the nature of her questions struck him as odd. "You wake up early every day?" she asked, watching him carefully as he answered. "Yes, usually before sunrise. The cattle need tending, and it's cooler in the early morning." "You have many neighbors?" Ayanna added, her tone casual but her eyes intent. "Not too many. The Johnson family lives about 5 miles east, and the Hendersons are maybe 10 miles north." "Why do you ask?" The sisters exchanged another one of those quick glances that Samuel was beginning to recognize. "Just curious," Ayanna said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. After they left that day, Samuel found himself thinking about their questions. Why would they want to know about his schedule or his neighbors? Maybe they were just making conversation, he told himself. After all, he was probably one of the few white men who had treated them kindly. Maybe they were simply trying to be friendly. The sisters began visiting regularly after that, showing up every week or two with new items to trade. Each time their English was a little better, and each time they asked more questions. They wanted to know about the local sheriff, about supply wagons that came through the area, about which ranchers had the most cattle and the most hired hands. Samuel started looking forward to their visits more than he cared to admit. The ranch could be a lonely place, and Ayanna and Helona brought a welcome break from his solitary routine. They were intelligent and well-spoken, and once they became more comfortable with English, they told him fascinating stories about Apache culture and traditions. But there were moments that puzzled him. Sometimes he would catch them speaking to each other in rapid, fluent English when they thought he wasn't paying attention. When he would turn to look at them directly, they would immediately switch back to their more halting, broken speech pattern. It was as if they were putting on an act for his benefit. One afternoon in late summer, Samuel was working near his well when the sisters arrived for their regular visit. They set up their pottery display in the shade of his porch, but instead of calling him over immediately, they began talking to each other in low voices. Samuel couldn't make out most of what they were saying, but he distinctly heard his name mentioned several times. Curious, he crept closer, trying to stay hidden behind his horse shed. The sisters were speaking in a mixture of English and Apache, but the English portions were clear and fluent, with no trace of the broken accent they used when talking to him. "Samuel trusts us completely now," he heard Ayanna say. "He answers all our questions without suspicion." "The other ranchers," Halona replied. "How many did he say had more than 10 head of cattle?" Samuel's blood went cold. He strained to hear more, but at that moment one of his horses whinnied loudly, and the sisters looked up. When they saw him approaching, their expressions immediately changed to the friendly, innocent smiles he had grown accustomed to. "Samuel," Ayanna called out cheerfully, her English once again broken and hesitant. "We bring beautiful new bowls today." For the rest of their visit, Samuel went through the motions of examining their pottery and making trades, but his mind was racing. What had he just overheard? Why were they discussing the other ranchers? And why were they pretending not to speak English well when they clearly could speak it perfectly? That night after the sisters had left, Samuel sat on his porch and tried to make sense of what he had heard. Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe they were just curious about their neighbors because they were considering visiting other ranches to trade their pottery. But something deep in his gut told him there was more to it than that. He thought about all the questions they had asked over the past few months. Questions about his daily routine, about his neighbors, about who lived where and how many people lived in each household. Questions about local law enforcement and supply routes. The kind of questions that someone would ask if they were gathering information for a specific purpose. Samuel shook his head, trying to dismiss his suspicions. These were two young women who had shown him nothing but kindness and friendship. They had brought beauty into his lonely life with their artwork and their stories. Surely he was just being paranoid. But as he went to bed that night, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to Ayanna and Halona than they were letting on, and for the first time since they had started visiting, he found himself wondering if he should trust them at all. Samuel couldn't get what he had overheard out of his mind. For days after the sisters' last visit, he found himself jumping at every sound and looking over his shoulder constantly. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, but doubt had planted itself firmly in his thoughts and refused to go away. A week later, he was mending a section of fence along the eastern edge of his property when he spotted two familiar figures in the distance. Ayanna and Halona were approaching, but something was different about their route. Instead of coming from the south, where they usually appeared, they were emerging from a rocky area to the north that Samuel had always assumed was impossible to pass through. The rocky outcropping was a jumbled mess of boulders and scraggly bushes that stretched for about half a mile. Samuel had explored it briefly when he first bought the land, but the terrain was so rough and difficult that he had quickly given up. Yet here were the sisters walking calmly out of what looked like solid rock. Samuel quickly ducked behind his fence post, watching as the sisters made their way across the open ground toward his ranch house. They moved with the easy confidence of people who had walked this path many times before, which was strange because Samuel was certain he had never seen them come from this direction. He waited until they were well past his position, then continued with his fence work, all the while keeping an eye on their location. They conducted their usual business with him, trading pottery for supplies and asking their typical questions about the area. But Samuel found it hard to concentrate on their conversation. All he could think about was where they had come from and what might be hidden in those rocks. After the sisters left, heading back the way they had come, Samuel waited a full hour before making his move. He gathered some tools as an excuse for being in the area, then walked casually toward the rocky outcropping. From a distance, it looked exactly as it always had, an impassable barrier of stone and thorny bushes. But as Samuel got closer, he began to notice things that hadn't been obvious from far away. Some of the bushes looked like they had been deliberately arranged, and there were subtle paths worn into the dirt between the rocks. It took him nearly an hour of careful searching, but finally, he found what he was looking for. Hidden behind a screen of carefully positioned brush and stones was a narrow passage that led deeper into the rocky area. The entrance was so well concealed that Samuel had to look at it from 3 different angles before he was sure it was actually there. Someone had spent considerable time and effort making sure this passage would remain hidden from casual observers. Samuel's heart was pounding as he squeezed through the narrow opening. The passage twisted and turned between the rocks for about 50 feet, before opening up into a natural clearing that was completely invisible from the outside. And in the center of that clearing was a cave entrance that had been enlarged and improved by human hands. Taking a deep breath, Samuel stepped into the cave. The interior was larger than he had expected, with enough room for several people to live comfortably. But it wasn't empty. Along the walls were stacks of supplies, blankets, dried food, water containers, and weapons. Lots of weapons. Samuel's hands shook as he examined the contents of the cave more closely. There were rifles, ammunition, knives, and even a few pieces of cavalry equipment that looked like they had been taken from soldiers. But the most disturbing discovery was a collection of papers spread out on a flat rock that served as a table. Maps. Detailed, hand-drawn maps showing not just Samuel's property, but every ranch, farm, and settlement for 50 miles in every direction. Each location was marked with notes written in English, describing how many people lived there, what kind of defenses they had, and how many horses and cattle they owned. Samuel recognized his own ranch on the map immediately. Next to it, someone had written in careful handwriting, "One man, Samuel Morrison. Trusting, no weapons visible. 15-20 cattle. 4 horses. Well water. Good access from North Rocks." His legs felt weak as he read the notations on other properties. The Johnson family was described as 3 men, 2 women, 1 child, armed, 30-plus cattle. The Henderson place was marked as 2 old men, 1 woman. Minimal defenses. Large horse herd. Every ranch and farm in the area was cataloged with military precision. Someone had been gathering intelligence on every white settlement for miles around, noting their strengths, weaknesses, and resources. And from the evidence in this cave, Samuel realized with growing horror that Ayanna and Halona were deeply involved in this operation. As he studied the maps more closely, Samuel noticed that each location was also marked with symbols that he didn't understand at first. Then he realized what they were: attack routes and escape paths. Someone was planning something big, something that would target multiple locations at once. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. The sisters had been using their pottery trading as a cover to scout the area and gather information. All their friendly questions, all their apparent interest in his daily life and his neighbors, had been part of an intelligence-gathering operation. But intelligence for what? And for whom? Samuel carefully examined the rest of the cave, looking for more clues. In one corner, he found additional supplies that suggested this hideout was being used regularly by multiple people. There were enough blankets and food stores for at least a dozen individuals, and the weapons cache was extensive enough to outfit a small army. As he prepared to leave the cave, Samuel noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the entrance. Multiple sets of prints, some of which belonged to the sisters, but others that were clearly made by men wearing boots. This wasn't just a hiding spot for Ayanna and Halona. It was a staging area for a much larger group. Samuel's mouth went dry as the full implications of his discovery began to sink in. The sisters weren't just scouts. They were advance agents for what looked like a major military operation. And he had been unknowingly helping them by answering their questions and allowing them to observe his property and routines. He had to get out of there before someone returned. Moving as quietly as possible, Samuel made his way back through the passage and out of the rocky area. As he walked back to his ranch, his mind was spinning with questions and fears. How many people were involved in this operation? What exactly were they planning? And most importantly, when were they planning to do it? That night, Samuel sat on his porch with his rifle across his lap, staring out at the dark landscape and wondering if he was already being watched. The sisters had seemed so friendly, so harmless. How could he have been so completely fooled? And what was he supposed to do now that he knew the truth? For 2 days after his discovery, Samuel barely slept. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every sound made him reach for his rifle. He kept expecting to see armed men emerging from the rocky outcropping, or to wake up surrounded by warriors ready to silence him permanently. But nothing happened. The desert remained quiet, and life went on as if nothing had changed. Samuel debated whether he should ride to town and alert the sheriff, but what would he tell him? That 2 friendly Apache women who traded pottery were actually spies, that he had found a hidden cave full of weapons and maps. It sounded crazy even to him, and he had seen the evidence with his own eyes. On the 3rd evening, just as the sun was setting behind the distant mountains, Samuel saw the sisters approaching his ranch again. His heart started pounding immediately. How was he supposed to act normal around them now that he knew what they really were? But as they got closer, Samuel noticed that something was different about their demeanor. They weren't walking with their usual calm confidence. Instead, they seemed agitated, constantly looking over their shoulders and moving faster than normal. When they reached his porch, both sisters looked genuinely distressed. "Samuel," Ayanna said, her voice tight with what appeared to be real anxiety. "We need help. Big storm coming. Very dangerous. We need shelter for tonight." Samuel looked up at the sky. It was clear, with only a few scattered clouds visible in the distance. There was no sign of any approaching weather, and the evening air was still and calm. Yet both sisters kept glancing nervously at the horizon as if expecting to see lightning at any moment. "Storm?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't see any storm clouds." "Apache no weather," Helona said quickly, her English still broken but her eyes sharp and alert. "Storm come fast, very bad. We need to stay in barn tonight, please." Every instinct Samuel had was screaming at him to refuse to send them away immediately. These women were dangerous, and having them stay overnight was the last thing he should do. But he also knew that acting suspicious might be even more dangerous. If they suspected that he had discovered their secret, there was no telling what they might do. "Of course," Samuel heard himself saying. "You can stay in the barn. There's fresh hay and it's dry and warm." Relief flashed across both sisters' faces, but Samuel noticed that their eyes remained alert and watchful. They thanked him repeatedly as he showed them to the barn and helped them settle in for the night. He brought them water and some food, trying to act as normally as possible while his mind raced with questions and fears. "Thank you, Samuel," Ayanna said as he prepared to leave them for the night. "You are a good friend to us." The word friend hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. He managed to smile and nod before walking back to his house, but inside he felt sick. How many times had they called him friend, while secretly gathering information that could be used against him and his neighbors? Samuel went through his normal evening routine, but he was far from relaxed. He cleaned his rifle and made sure it was loaded, then did the same with his pistol. He checked that his doors and windows were secure, though he knew they would provide little protection if the sisters' companions decided to attack. As the night grew darker, Samuel lay in his bed fully clothed, listening to every sound from outside. The barn was only about 50 yards from his house, and he could occasionally hear the sisters moving around inside. At first their movement seemed normal, the sounds of people settling down for sleep. But then, around midnight, Samuel heard voices. At first the voices were so quiet that he thought he might be imagining them, but as he lay still and listened carefully, he could definitely hear Ayanna and Helona talking in the barn. The tone of their conversation sounded urgent, almost heated, but he couldn't make out any words through the walls of his house. Samuel's curiosity and fear got the better of him. Moving as quietly as possible, he slipped out of his bed and crept to his window. From there he could see the barn clearly, but the voices were still too muffled to understand. He needed to get closer. The walk from his house to the barn felt like the longest 50 yards of Samuel's life. Every step seemed to echo loudly in the still night air, and he was certain that the sisters would hear him coming. But they seemed completely absorbed in their conversation, which was growing more intense by the minute. When Samuel reached the barn, he pressed himself against the wooden wall near the door. The sisters were sitting just on the other side of the wall, and now he could hear them clearly. What he heard made his blood run cold. They weren't speaking in their usual broken English. Instead, they were talking rapidly and fluently, switching between perfect English and Apache with an ease that proved they were both completely bilingual. And they were talking about him. "Samuel suspects nothing," Ayanna was saying in clear, unaccented English. "He still thinks we're just harmless traders." Even tonight, when we gave him that ridiculous story about a storm, he believed us completely. Good, Helona replied, her voice now cold and calculating instead of the sweet, uncertain tone she used during the day. We needed to be in position tonight. The signal fires will be lit at dawn, and we need to be ready to guide them in. Samuel's legs went weak. Signal fires. Guide them in. The sisters weren't just gathering information. They were actively preparing for an attack that was apparently scheduled for the next morning. How many warriors will come? Helona asked. 43, Ayana answered. Chief Running Bear decided to include the extra group from the eastern camp. He wants to hit all the ranches simultaneously, before anyone can ride for help. 43 warriors. Samuel's mind reeled as he tried to process this information. It wasn't just going to be a raid on his ranch. It was going to be a coordinated attack on multiple locations, and it was going to happen at dawn less than 6 hours away. And Samuel? Helona asked quietly. There was a long pause before Ayana answered, and when she did, her voice was matter-of-fact and emotionless. Chief Running Bear was clear about the orders. No witnesses. Samuel has seen too much, been too friendly. Someone might suspect we gathered information from him. He cannot be allowed to talk to the soldiers afterward. Samuel felt like he might vomit. The two women he had welcomed into his home, had traded with and befriended, were calmly discussing his murder. And not just his murder, the murder of dozens of innocent families who had no idea what was coming for them at sunrise. The Johnson family, Helona continued. The men will be killed immediately. The woman and child will be taken captive along with the horses and cattle that can be moved quickly. Same with the Hendersons and the others. Samuel closed his eyes, trying to control the panic that was threatening to overwhelm him. Men, women, and children were going to be killed or captured in just a few hours, and he was the only person who knew about it, the only person who could possibly warn them and save their lives. But first he had to figure out how to get away from his own ranch without alerting the sisters that he had discovered their plan. And he had to do it before dawn brought 43 Apache warriors down on the unsuspecting families scattered across the territory. Samuel remained pressed against the barn wall, his heart hammering so loudly he was afraid the sisters might hear it. The conversation inside continued, and each word he heard made the situation more terrifying and more urgent. Tell me again about the attack sequence, Helona said, and Samuel could hear the rustle of papers. They must be looking at the maps he had found in the cave. The signal fire on Eagle Peak will be lit exactly at sunrise, Ayana explained, her voice clinical and precise. When Chief Running Bear sees it, he'll divide the warriors into 7 groups. The first group will hit the Morrison Ranch, that's here. Samuel will be eliminated quickly and quietly. Samuel's knees nearly buckled when he heard. His own death discussed so. Casually. The second group will move on the Johnson place. Immediately after, Ayana continued. Tom Johnson is known to be a good shot, so they'll approach from the blind side of his barn where he can't see them from his house. Mary Johnson and the little boy will be taken alive if possible. The chief has plans for them. Samuel thought of the Johnson family. Tom was a decent man who had helped Samuel with his cattle more than once. Mary was a kind woman who always brought fresh bread when she visited. Their son Billy was only 8 years old and loved to play with Samuel's old dog whenever they came by. Group 3 takes the Henderson Ranch, Ayana went on. Those old men won't put up much of a fight, but they have the largest horse herd in the area. The warriors will need to move those animals quickly before anyone notices they're missing. The Henderson brothers were both in their 60s, peaceful men who had never hurt anyone. Samuel couldn't bear to think of what would happen to them. What about the Murphy family? Helona asked. Group 4. But they're the most dangerous target. Murphy has 3 grown sons, all of them good with rifles. The warriors will hit them just after dawn when they're doing their morning chores in the barn. Separate them so they can't defend each other. Samuel knew the Murphy family well. The father, Patrick, and his 3 sons ran one of the most successful ranches in the territory. They were tough, capable men, but even they wouldn't stand a chance against a surprise attack by trained Apache warriors. The Williams family? Helona continued down what was apparently a detailed list. Group 5. Williams is usually alone in the mornings. His hired hands don't arrive until later. Easy target. His cattle are already gathered in the south pasture. Perfect for driving away quickly. The conversation went on, with the sisters methodically reviewing the planned attack on each ranch and homestead in the area. Samuel realized with growing horror that they had been gathering information for months, not just from him but probably from other sources as well. They knew everyone's routines, everyone's weaknesses, and exactly how to strike for maximum effect. And after the initial attacks? Halona asked. The warriors regroup at Miller's Creek with whatever cattle and horses they've captured, Ayana said. Any captives will be held there while Chief Running Bear decides which ones to keep and which ones. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. What about the cavalry from Fort Bradley? Halona asked. How long before they respond? At least 6 hours, probably longer. By the time anyone realizes what's happened and gets word to the fort, we'll be long gone into the mountains. Chief Running Bear has already scouted the escape routes. Samuel's mind was racing as he tried to calculate distances and timing. Fort Bradley was almost 30 miles away, and the soldiers there had no idea that an attack was being planned. Even if someone managed to get word to them immediately after the attacks began, it would be hours before help could arrive. By then, the raiders would have vanished into the wilderness with their captives and stolen livestock. You're certain about the timing? Halona asked. Completely. We've watched these families for months. Every one of them follows the same routine every morning. The men will be in their barns or out with their cattle, separated from their houses and their weapons. The women and children will be inside, helpless. The cold calculation in Ayana's voice was chilling. These weren't just random attacks. They were carefully planned military operations designed to maximize casualties and minimize resistance. And our escape route? Halona asked. As soon as the signal fire is lit, we slip out of Samuel's barn and head north to the cave. We'll wait there until the attacks are complete, then meet up with Chief Running Bear's group at Miller's Creek. If anyone survived and tries to track the war party, they'll assume we came from the south or east. No one will think to look in the rocky area where we've been hiding. Samuel thought about the cave he had discovered, packed with weapons and supplies. It was the perfect staging area for this kind of operation, close enough to observe the target area but completely hidden from view. How many captives is Chief Running Bear hoping to take? Halona asked. At least 6 or 7, maybe more if the attacks go smoothly. Young women and children are worth the most in trade with the Mexican slavers. The old ones will probably be killed on the spot. Samuel had to bite his lip to keep from gasping out loud. Not only were innocent people going to be murdered, but some would be sold into slavery. Women and children he knew, people he cared about, were going to suffer fates worse than death. The horses and cattle? Chief Running Bear estimates we can drive away at least 200 head of cattle and maybe 30 horses. Enough to feed and supply the band through the winter, with plenty left over to trade. As Samuel listened to the sisters discuss their plans with such matter-of-fact cruelty, he felt something inside him change. These weren't the friendly, harmless women he had thought he knew. They were cold-blooded killers who had been playing a role for months, earning his trust so they could gather the information needed to murder him and his neighbors. One more thing, Ayana said, her voice dropping to an even quieter level. Chief Running Bear wants to make sure this sends a message to other white settlers in the territory. He wants the attacks to be memorable, especially what happens to Samuel since he was so helpful to us. Halona laughed softly, a sound that made Samuel's skin crawl. Samuel was so trusting. Almost too easy. Perfect for our purposes, though. His information about the other ranches was more detailed than anything we could have gotten through direct observation, Samuel realized with sick certainty that every friendly conversation he'd had with the sisters, every question he had answered about his neighbors and their routines, had been used to plan their murders. His kindness and trust had been turned into weapons against the people he cared about. The sisters began to settle down for what remained of the night, apparently satisfied that their plans were solid. But Samuel knew that sleep was impossible for him. In just a few hours the sun would rise, and with it would come the most brutal day in the history of this peaceful valley, unless he could find a way to stop it. Samuel crept away from the barn as quietly as possible, his mind spinning with the horror of what he had learned. Back in his house, he sat on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands, trying to figure out what to do. The clock on his wall showed it was nearly 2 a.m. Sunrise was less than 4 hours away. His first instinct was to saddle his horse immediately and ride hard for the Johnson Ranch, then the Hendersons, then the Murphys, warning each family in turn. But even as he considered this plan, he realized it was probably impossible. The ranches were spread across many miles of rough terrain, and there was no way he could reach them all before dawn. Even if he managed to warn some of them, others would still be caught completely off guard. Worse, if the sisters discovered he was gone, they would know immediately that their plan had been compromised. They could signal their Confederates to accelerate the timeline or change the attack routes. The element of surprise that might give the families a fighting chance would be lost. Samuel paced back and forth in his small living room, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor that seemed dangerously loud in the quiet night. Every few minutes he would stop and listen, making sure the sisters were still in the barn and hadn't noticed his absence. Maybe he could ride straight to Fort Bradley and alert the cavalry. The soldiers could respond in force and intercept the war party before they reached the ranches. But Fort Bradley was 30 miles away across difficult country. Even riding his fastest horse, Samuel wouldn't reach the fort until well after sunrise. By the time he convinced the commanding officer to take action and got the troops organized, the attacks would be over and the raiders long gone. Samuel considered trying to sneak out and disable the sisters somehow, preventing them from giving their signal or guiding the war party, but what would he do with them? And what if there were other scouts in the area who would wonder why the signal never came? The attack might proceed anyway, just with less precise coordination. As the minutes ticked by, Samuel found himself facing an impossible choice. No matter what course of action he considered, innocent people were going to die. The best he could hope for was to minimize the casualties, but even that seemed unlikely given the short time he had to work with. Then another thought occurred to him, one that made his stomach clench with dread. What if he did nothing? What if he just stayed in his house, pretended to sleep, and let events unfold as the sisters had planned? He would die, of course, probably within the first few minutes of the attack, but at least he wouldn't have to live with the knowledge that his actions had led to even more deaths. Samuel immediately felt ashamed of this thought. He couldn't just give up and let his neighbors be slaughtered without even trying to save them. Tom and Mary Johnson, the Henderson brothers, the Murphy family, they all deserved better than that. They deserved someone willing to fight for their lives, even if the odds were hopeless. He walked to his window and looked out at the barn where the sisters were sleeping. They looked so peaceful lying there, probably dreaming about the successful completion of their mission. In just a few hours, they would emerge from that barn and help guide 43 Apache warriors to the massacre of everyone Samuel cared about, unless he stopped them. The idea came to him suddenly, and it was so simple and so terrible that he almost dismissed it immediately. But as he thought it through, Samuel realized it might be the only option that had any real chance of saving lives. He could trap the sisters in the barn if Ayanna and Helona couldn't get out to give their signals or provide guidance to the war party. The entire carefully planned operation might fall apart. The warriors would still attack, but they would be operating without crucial intelligence. They wouldn't know exactly where to find their targets or how to approach each ranch for maximum surprise. More importantly, they wouldn't know that their presence had been discovered. The families would still be caught off guard, but at least they wouldn't be facing an enemy that knew their every weakness and routine. Samuel's hands shook as he considered what this plan would require. He would have to barricade the barn doors from the outside, trapping two people who had shown him nothing but kindness and friendship, even if that friendship had been an act. He would be condemning them to capture or death when the authorities eventually arrived. But those same two people were planning to help murder innocent children. They had spent months earning his trust specifically so they could gather information to use in killing his neighbors. Whatever kindness they had shown him had been completely fake, a tool to manipulate him into cooperation. Samuel thought about 8-year-old Billy Johnson, who would probably be killed along with his parents if the attack proceeded as planned. He thought about the Henderson brothers who had never hurt anyone in their lives but would be slaughtered for their horses. He thought about the young women who would be taken as slaves and the families who would be torn apart forever. The choice wasn't really impossible after all. It was horrible, but it wasn't impossible. Samuel quietly gathered the supplies he would need: rope, his hammer, some wooden boards left over from a recent repair project. He would have to work quickly and silently, barricading the barn before the sisters woke up. Then he would have to ride hard to reach as many ranches as possible before dawn, warning the families and helping them prepare defenses. It wasn't a perfect plan. People would still probably die before the morning was over. but it was the only plan that gave the innocent families any real chance of survival. As Samuel prepared to put his desperate scheme into action, he tried not to think about the look of betrayal that would be in Ayana's eyes when she realized what he had done. He tried not to remember the story she had told him about Apache culture, or the way Helona had smiled shyly when he complimented her pottery. None of that had been real anyway. The real Ayana and Helona were the cold-blooded killers he had overheard in the barn, calmly planning the murder of children and the enslavement of women. Everything else had been an act designed to use his decent instincts against him. Samuel took a deep breath, picked up his supplies, and stepped out into the night. He had less than 4 hours to save as many lives as possible, and he couldn't afford to waste another second on doubt or regret. The battle at the Murphy Ranch lasted for nearly 2 hours. The Apache warriors fought with desperate courage, but they were facing prepared defenders instead of helpless victims. Patrick Murphy and his sons were experienced fighters who knew their land well, and they used every advantage they could find. Samuel fought alongside them, his rifle cracking steadily as he tried to keep the attackers at bay. Around midday, the sound of bugle calls echoed across the valley, and dust clouds appeared on the horizon. The cavalry from Fort Bradley had finally arrived, alerted by riders who had escaped from the other attacked ranches. Faced with professional soldiers and well-prepared settlers, the Apache warriors began to retreat. Samuel watched as they melted away into the landscape, carrying their wounded with them and abandoning their plans of capturing cattle and horses. The great coordinated attack that Ayana and Helona had spent months preparing had turned into a costly failure. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Samuel rode back across the valley to check on the other families. The news was mixed. The Johnson family had survived the attack on their ranch, though Tom had been wounded in the shoulder. The Henderson brothers were both alive, but their house had been burned and most of their horses stolen. Other families hadn't been as fortunate. The Williams ranch had been hit before Samuel could reach them with his warning, and Williams himself had been killed defending his property. 2 of his hired hands were also dead, though his wife and children had managed to escape to safety. When Samuel finally returned to his own ranch, he found it partially burned and his cattle scattered. But he was alive, which was more than Ayana and Helona had planned for him. The barn where he had trapped the sisters was surrounded by cavalry soldiers. "We found them locked inside," the cavalry captain told Samuel. "They were pretty angry about it. Kept demanding to know why you had imprisoned them." Samuel looked at the 2 women who had been his friends and his enemies simultaneously. They were sitting in the back of a military wagon, their hands bound, their faces filled with cold hatred as they stared at him. "They were spies," Samuel explained to the captain. "They'd been gathering information about all the ranches in the area. The attack this morning was planned using intelligence they collected." The captain nodded grimly. "We found maps in a cave about a mile from here. Detailed drawings of every ranch and farm in the territory, with notes about defenses and routines. Professional military reconnaissance." As the cavalry prepared to leave with their prisoners, Ayana called out to Samuel. Her voice was no longer the broken English she had used during their trading sessions, but the educated, fluent speech he had overheard in the barn. "You think you've won something," she said, her dark eyes burning with hatred. "But you've only delayed the inevitable. There will be other attacks, other scouts. Your people don't belong on this land." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, remembering the woman who had brought him beautiful pottery and told him stories about Apache culture. That woman had never really existed. She had been a carefully constructed fiction designed to manipulate him into helping with his own murder. "Baby," Samuel replied quietly, "but not today, and not with information I helped provide." As the military wagon disappeared into the distance, Samuel stood alone in the ruins of his ranch and tried to process what had happened. He had saved lives, that much was certain. The Johnson boy was alive because Samuel had acted. The Murphy family had survived because they had been warned in time. Even the Henderson brothers, despite their losses, were alive to rebuild. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Samuel's trust had been shattered in a way that could never be fully repaired. Every stranger who approached his ranch in the future would be viewed with suspicion. Every friendly gesture would be analyzed for hidden motives. The innocence that had allowed him to see the best in people had been burned away by betrayal. Over the following weeks, as Samuel rebuilt his ranch and tried to return to normal life, he found himself thinking constantly about the sisters. Late at night, when the desert wind whistled around his house, he would remember their laughter and their stories. He would think about the beautiful pottery they had made and wonder if any part of their friendship had been real. The rational part of his mind knew the answer. Everything had been calculated, from their first approach to his ranch to their final words of hatred. They had studied him, learned his weaknesses, and exploited his decency for their own purposes. He had been nothing more than a source of intelligence to them, a useful fool who could be manipulated into providing information about his neighbors. But knowing this didn't make the sense of betrayal any easier to bear. Samuel had genuinely cared about Ayanna and Helona, had looked forward to their visits and worried about their safety. Finding out that none of it had been real was like discovering that months of his life had been built on lies. The other ranchers in the area treated Samuel as a hero afterward, spread about how he had discovered the plot and warned his neighbors. But Samuel didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had learned a hard lesson about the dangers of trust in a world where survival often depended on suspicion. Years later, when Samuel was an old man telling stories to his grandchildren, he would still remember every detail of that terrible night when he pressed his ear against the barn wall and heard the truth about the women he had considered friends. The memory would always carry a bitter weight, reminding him that sometimes the greatest kindness could be turned into the cruelest weapon. The Apache sisters had taught him that evil could wear a friendly face and speak in gentle voices. They had shown him that trust, while necessary for human connection, could also be a deadly vulnerability. It was a lesson that Samuel carried with him for the rest of his life, making him wiser but also sadder, more careful but also more alone. In the end, Samuel Morrison had saved his neighbors and survived to tell the tale. But he had also lost something precious that morning: the ability to take friendship at face value and trust in the basic goodness of strangers. It was a price he was willing to pay to save innocent lives, but it was a price nonetheless, one that he would go on paying for the rest of his days.